The first time Clara Whitmore saw the man they called Rafe Calloway, he was bleeding from a wound in his side and still managed to tip his hat to her as though they had met at a Sunday social. It was the autumn of 1878, and the town of Dustfield, New Mexico Territory, sat baking under a sky the color of hammered copper. The Santa Fe Trail had brought enough souls through that particular stretch of desert to fill the church on Sundays and the saloon every other night of the week, and Dustfield had grown from a collection of 3 canvas tents into something resembling a proper town, with a general store, a livery, a doctor's office, a school that doubled as a courthouse when needed, and a main street wide enough for 2 wagons to pass each other without either driver losing his temper. It was a rough place, but it had its graces. The sunsets were extraordinary. The coffee at Me Holt's boarding house was strong enough to revive a man from the dead. And there was, in the late weeks of October, a certain quality to the morning air that made even the most hardened of souls pause and breathe a little deeper. Clara had come to Dustfield 6 months earlier with her father, Elias Whitmore, who had purchased a modest parcel of land 3 miles east of town, with the intention of raising cattle and growing old with some dignity. Elias was a good man, quiet and deliberate, the sort who measured his words before speaking and his whiskey before drinking. He had brought Clara west after the death of her mother 2 years prior, believing that a new landscape might ease a grief that had settled into both of them like dust into the floorboards. Clara was 22 years old, with dark auburn hair that she kept pinned beneath a wide-brimmed hat when she worked outdoors and wore loose in the evenings when she sat on the porch and read whatever books she could borrow from the schoolteacher, a kind old woman named Mrs. Prout, who had brought an entire trunk of novels from Philadelphia. Clara had adapted to frontier life with a quiet practicality that surprised even herself. She could mend a fence line, fire a rifle with reasonable accuracy, tend a vegetable garden in soil that fought back, and bargain with the merchants in town without ever appearing desperate. She was not a woman who needed rescuing, and she would have been the first to say so. But she was also not a woman immune to loneliness, and there were evenings when the silence of the desert pressed in so completely that she would find herself sitting very still, listening for something she could not name. She was in town that October morning to collect a shipment of flour and salt at Briggs' General Store when she heard the commotion outside. A horse had come in from the south at a gallop, lathered and wild-eyed, and its rider was slumped forward over the pommel with one hand gripping the reins and the other pressed flat against his ribs. Several men had moved into the street to catch the horse, and by the time Clara stepped out of the store with her basket, there was already a small crowd gathered around the fallen rider, who had been lowered onto the boards of the sidewalk. She pushed through the edge of the crowd, not out of morbid curiosity, but because she had basic knowledge of poultices and wound cleaning that she had learned from her mother, and she could see that the men standing around were doing nothing useful except making comments about the severity of the wound. The man on the boards was tall, even lying down. He had dark hair, several days of stubble across his jaw, and the kind of face that was not conventionally handsome, but was deeply compelling in the way that weathered and honest things tend to be. His shirt was dark with blood along his left side, but his eyes were open, and they were a shade of gray-blue that seemed almost out of place in the bright, brutal light of the territory. He was perhaps 28 or 29 years old, and even flat on his back on a sidewalk with a wound in his side. There was something contained about him, something that suggested he was managing the situation from the inside. When Clara knelt beside him and pulled back the edge of his shirt to see the wound, he turned his head toward her and said with perfect steadiness, "Ma'am," and touched the brim of his hat with 2 fingers, which was an extraordinary thing to do given the circumstances. "Hold still," she said, and he did. The wound was a deep graze from a bullet, not a penetrating shot, but it had torn through enough flesh to need proper cleaning and stitching. Clara looked up at the men standing around. "Someone fetch Dr. Aldridge," she said, and someone else bring clean water and a cloth." Nobody moved immediately, so she said it again, sharper this time, and 2 men scattered. She kept pressure on the wound with her folded handkerchief while they waited, and the man on the boards watched her with those gray-blue eyes and said nothing further, which she found oddly respectful. Most men in her experience, when being tended to, felt compelled to minimize their injuries out loud or thank you every 30 seconds. "What is your name?" she asked, more to keep him alert than out of genuine curiosity, though both were true. "Calloway," he said. "Rafe Calloway." "Who shot you, Mr. Calloway?" A pause, a disagreement. "That is not a name." "No," he agreed, "it is not." Dr. Aldridge arrived with his bag, and Clara stepped back to make room, but she did not leave. She watched the doctor work, noting the deftness of the older man's hands, the way he spoke quietly to his patient to keep him calm. When it was done and Rafe Calloway had been moved to the doctor's office on a makeshift stretcher, Clara collected her basket and her thoughts and walked back to Briggs' store to finish her errands. She thought about him on the ride home. Not romantically, she told herself, just practically. He had struck her as someone interesting, and interesting things were not in great supply in Dustfield. She found out the rest of it over the next few days through the particular efficiency of small-town gossip, which operated with the speed and thoroughness of a telegraph line. Rafe Calloway was known throughout the Southern Territories as a range rider and sometime deputy, a man who had worked for the law in 3 different counties before something had gone sideways in Silver City, and he had ridden out of that town under a cloud that people described differently depending on who you asked. Some said he had shot a man who did not deserve shooting. Others said the man deserved it, and then some, but that it had been inconvenient for the local authorities regardless. There was no wanted poster with his name on it, which meant either that he had been innocent of wrongdoing or that whoever mattered most had decided to look away. He stayed in Dustfield for 2 weeks while he healed, boarding at Me Holt's establishment, and during that time he was quiet and polite and caused no trouble of any kind. He ate at the common table with the other boarders, helped me carry firewood without being asked, and spent his afternoons sitting in the chair on the front porch, reading a pocket Bible with the cover worn entirely smooth. Clara saw him again on the 5th day, when she came into town to collect the mail and found herself walking past Me Holt's at precisely the moment he was settling into the porch chair with his book. He looked up and recognized her, and something shifted in his expression that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. "The woman who held her handkerchief to my side," he said. "Clara Whitmore," she said, and stopped walking because it would have seemed rude not to. "I owe you a debt of gratitude, Miss Whitmore." "You owe Dr. Aldridge a debt of gratitude," she said. "I just applied pressure." "That is sometimes the most important thing," he said. She stood at the base of the porch steps and looked at him directly, the way she had learned to look at people in a land where reading character quickly was a practical skill. He met her gaze without flinching or performing, and she found she liked that. "You are reading Psalms," she said, noticing the page he had marked with his thumb, a flicker of genuine surprise. "You can see that from there. The pages of Psalms are always the most worn," she said, "in any Bible that has been carried a long time." He looked down at the book in his hands, then back up at her. "That is an astute observation." "I am an astute person," she said, and continued on her way to the post office. She was smiling before she reached the end of the block, and she did not entirely know why. Over the following days, she found reasons to be in town that she might not otherwise have manufactured. She told herself this was coincidence, and then stopped bothering to tell herself that because it was plainly untrue. She wanted to talk to him again. The realization was simple and clear-edged, like water in a glass, and she saw no reason to be complicated about it. He was recovering well, and by the end of the first week, he was walking with only a slight stiffness that he disguised when he thought anyone was watching. On the 8th day, she encountered him at Briggs' store, where he was purchasing coffee and tobacco and a new pair of leather gloves, and they walked together for a stretch of Main Street entirely by accident, and then by mutual agreement kept walking when the accident had run its course. He asked her about the Whitmore ranch, and she told him about her father's plans for cattle and the difficulties of water rights in the territory. He listened with the full attention of someone who had actually worked range land, asking questions that demonstrated he knew what he was asking about. She learned that he had grown up in Texas, in the hill country north of San Antonio, and that he had a younger sister named Beulah who was married and living in Abilene and who he wrote to every month. "You are close with your sister," Clara said. "I was not always," he said. "We were not easy with each other when we were young, but time has a way of smoothing things, or roughing them up further." "Yes," he said, "that is also possible." They stopped at the edge of town where the road turned south, and he faced her with that same direct, contained regard that she had noticed on the sidewalk boards. "I expect to ride out within the week," he said. "My side is mending. Where will you go?" She asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I have been considering that. There is work available further north. Some of the larger outfits near Santa Fe are hiring for the winter roundup." She nodded. It was a sensible plan. She had no reason to feel any particular way about it. "Well," she said, "good luck to you, Mr. Calloway." "Thank you, Miss Whitmore." She turned and walked back toward the center of town, and she did not look back because she was a sensible woman. But she listened to her own footsteps on the dry road and thought that the territory seemed a very large and empty place. He did not ride out that Friday as he had indicated. He stayed through the weekend, and on Sunday morning she saw him in church, which surprised her because he had not struck her as a man who attended services. He sat 3 pews behind her father and herself, and he sang the hymns without looking at the hymn book, which meant he knew them by heart, and something about that detail moved her in a way that was entirely disproportionate to the information. After the service, in the dusty yard outside the white-painted church, her father Elias introduced himself to Rafe Calloway with the frank, assessing friendliness of a man who has worked the land long enough to trust his instincts about people. They spoke for several minutes about cattle prices and the quality of the winter grazing south of the Pecos, and Clara stood beside her father and listened and occasionally said something, and Rafe Calloway spoke to her as a full participant in the conversation, not as a decoration, which she appreciated more than she expressed. "You should come to supper," her father said, with the easy generosity that was one of his better qualities. "We are not fancy people, but Clara sets a good table." Rafe looked at her, a look that asked permission rather than assumed it. "If it is no inconvenience," he said. "It is not," she said. He came that Wednesday evening, riding out to the ranch on the bay horse that he had apparently purchased to replace the animal that had been injured during whatever altercation had landed him in Dustfield. He wore a clean shirt and had shaved properly, and he brought a bottle of whiskey for her father and a small parcel wrapped in brown paper for Clara, which turned out to contain a book of poetry by Alfred Lord Tennyson that he had evidently special ordered from Briggs' store, who occasionally stocked reading material alongside the flour and the nails. "I noticed you are a reader," he said, handing it to her on the porch with a straightforwardness that was somehow more touching than ceremony would have been. Clara held the book and felt something warm and complicated move through her. "Thank you," she said. "Tennyson is perhaps an indulgence," he said, "but I thought you might enjoy him." "I have read him before," she said. "I am very glad to own a copy." Supper was simple and good. Her father had killed a chicken, and Clara had roasted it with herbs from her garden, and there were biscuits and gravy, and a dried apple pie that she was genuinely proud of. Rafe ate with evident pleasure and complimented the food in the specific way of a man who had eaten many meals alone and understood what it meant for someone to cook carefully. After supper, her father sat on the porch with his whiskey and his pipe, and Clara washed up in the kitchen, and Rafe appeared in the doorway with his sleeves rolled up and said, "May I help?" And she handed him a dish towel without ceremony. They stood at the washboard together in the lamplight, and outside the crickets were performing their nightly concert with great enthusiasm, and the sky through the small window was black and absolutely spangled with stars the way it only was this far from anything that could be called a city. "Why did you stay?" she asked. She had not planned the question. He considered it. "I told myself it was because my horse needed more rest." "And was that the true reason?" Another pause, longer this time. "Not entirely, no." She handed him a wet plate. "What was the other part?" "I think you know," he said quietly. She did know. But she appreciated that he said it plainly rather than dancing around it. And she appreciated equally that he did not say more than that, which would have been too much too soon. There was a rightness to his sense of proportion. They finished the dishes. He thanked her father and shook his hand and rode back to town in the blue dark, and Clara stood on the porch long after the sound of his horse had faded and watched the stars and felt something she had not felt in quite some time, which was hopeful. The following weeks unfolded with the gentle and deliberate pace of two careful people who are both aware of what is happening between them and are choosing not to rush it. He found work helping with the Whitmore fence line, which needed extensive repair before winter, and Elias hired him at a fair wage with no awkwardness about the arrangement. Rafe worked as he did everything else, with a focused competence and without unnecessary conversation, though he was not unfriendly. He and Elias fell into the easy rhythm of men who understand each other's rhythms. Clara brought lunch out to the fence line each midday, and this became the part of her day she looked forward to most. She and Rafe would sit in whatever shade was available, which in the open territory was not much, and eat and talk. He told her about his years riding for various cattle outfits, about a particularly brutal winter in Colorado that he had survived in a lined shack with 3 feet of snow outside, and nothing to read but an almanac from 4 years previous. She told him about her childhood in Missouri, about her mother's kitchen, and the sound of piano music on summer evenings, and the very specific grief of watching someone strong become slowly fragile. He listened to that last part without offering consolation, which was the right thing to do because consolation would have diminished it, and she found she could breathe more easily after saying it. She began to understand him in the layered way you understand landscape that you have looked at many times and still discover new things within. He was a man of genuine principle who carried his failures with a heaviness that sometimes weighted his silence. She could see it in the way he would occasionally go somewhere inside himself, behind those gray-blue eyes, some place where things he had done or not done lived and required accounting. She did not press him on this. She trusted that if they continued in the direction they were going, he would tell her in his own time. He kissed her for the first time on a late November afternoon, when the first cold of the season had come down from the north, and the sky was the color of pewter and smelled of possible snow. They were standing at the gate of the corral after he had finished for the day, and she had come out to tell him that supper would be ready in half an hour, and he had looked at her in the fading light with an expression that was entirely unguarded, which was rare for him, and she had thought, there it is, the thing underneath all the containment, and then he had stepped forward slowly and carefully and kissed her with a gentleness that was also somehow very certain. She kissed him back. The wind moved across the open land and lifted strands of her hair loose from their pins, and somewhere in the far distance a coyote made its sound, and it was all exactly right. He stepped back and looked at her with a seriousness that she recognized was not doubt about her but something else, something older and interior. "Clara," he said, and then stopped. "Yes," she said, because she wanted him to continue. "I need to tell you something," he said. "About Silver City." She waited. He told her. It came out in the measured, stripped-down language of a man confessing to a priest. Each word weighed before it was offered. In Silver City, he had been a deputy under a sheriff named Elroy Hatch, who had been corrupt in the quiet and comprehensive way that small-town power allows, skimming protection money from the businesses, turning blind eyes to violence when the perpetrators were wealthy enough to make his blindness comfortable. Rafe had assembled the evidence. He had gone to the territorial marshal's office in Santa Fe. And then the man he had given his evidence to, a man named Colton Vance, had turned out to be in Hatch's pocket, and the whole thing had folded in on him like a bad hand in poker. What had followed was a campaign to discredit him. Hatch had spread the story that Rafe had shot a prisoner in custody, which was false but sufficiently detailed to create genuine doubt. Rafe had no proof of his innocence beyond his own word. He had left Silver City because staying would have meant confronting violence with violence, and he had not wanted to do that, and he was not entirely sure even now whether that restraint had been wisdom or cowardice. "I do not know if it was the right choice," he said. "Leaving. I have thought about it many times." "You kept yourself from becoming what you were fighting against," Clara said, "or I ran." "Those are not always different things," she said. "Sometimes running is the only clean option." He looked at her steadily. "You are generous." "I am honest," she said. "Generosity would mean I thought less clearly about it than I do." He was quiet for a moment, turning his hat in his hands. "There is more to it," he said. "The prisoner they said I shot, he died. Not by my hand, but he died in that jail, and I was the last one to see him alive. And I have never been able to fully clear myself of the feeling that I should have done something different that night to prevent it, even if I do not know what." "A man can carry guilt that does not belong to him," she said. "A man can," he agreed. "But it does not stop the carrying." She understood then more completely the weight she had seen in his silences. She also understood that he was not telling her this story to ask her to absolve him. He was telling her because she deserved to know who he was before whatever was happening between them went further. "Rafe," she said. She had used his given name only twice before, and he noticed every time. "What you have told me does not change my opinion of you. It deepens it, but it does not change the direction." He looked at her for a long moment. "You are remarkable," he said softly. "I am ordinary," she said. "You are just perhaps unused to people being straightforward." The winter settled in around Dustfield with less fury than winters further north, but enough bite to make the evenings sharp. Rafe had taken a room permanently at Mee Holt's and was now working for several of the local ranchers as needed, having established a reputation as reliable and skilled. He and Clara had what the town recognized as a courtship, which meant they were seen together regularly, and everyone had opinions about it that they expressed to each other rather than directly to the parties involved, which was the decorous frontier compromise between curiosity and manners. Clara's father said very little about the situation directly, but one evening in December he sat down across from his daughter at the kitchen table with his coffee and said, "He is a good man." And Clara said, "Yes, he is." And Elias nodded and went back to his reading, which was the entirety of his commentary on the matter, and which was sufficient. It was in December also that the trouble came back, because trouble has a way of following people who have been entangled with it, even when they have done their best to move on. A rider came into Dustfield on a gray Thursday morning and asked at the saloon for Rafe Calloway, which was reported immediately to 3 different people who each had their own reasons for caring. By the time Rafe was told about it, the rider was waiting for him on the main street with the easy confidence of a man who expects to be obeyed. He was not young, this rider. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, thick through the chest, with a sheriff's badge pinned to his coat that read Hidalgo County. His name, as he introduced himself with a deliberate slowness that was meant to establish hierarchy, was Sheriff Clarence Mott, and he had ridden from Silver City with papers that requested, though with the strongly implied force of demanded, that Rafe Calloway return with him to answer certain questions regarding a matter that had been reopened. Clara was on the street when this happened. She had been coming out of the post office when she saw Rafe standing square in the road, his hands loose at his sides, and the broad man on the horse looking down at him, with an expression of professional satisfaction that she found immediately offensive. She stood on the boardwalk and listened. The papers Mott held were from the office of the territorial marshal, but not from Colton Vance, who it turned out had resigned his position the previous spring following an investigation that had apparently grown larger than Rafe's original complaint. A new marshal, A man named Theodore Graves had taken over the office and was, by all accounts, conducting himself with some actual integrity. The questions Mott wanted Rafe to answer were apparently not accusations, but testimony that the new marshal's office needed in order to complete its case against Elroy Hatch, who had finally been arrested. This was what Mott explained eventually when Rafe asked him to be plain about the purpose of his visit. Rafe stood very still for a moment. "Hatch is in custody. Has been for 6 weeks, Mott said. We need your account of what you witnessed. You are not under any charge yourself. The new marshal is clear on that." Rafe looked down at the papers in his hands, then up at the sky, then at Clara on the boardwalk, and she saw something moving across his face that was not quite relief but was related to it, some adjustment in the internal weight distribution she had understood him to carry. "I will need 2 days to arrange my affairs," he said to Mott. "I can allow that," Mott said. Mott rode off to find himself a meal and a bed at the hotel, and Rafe walked to where Clara stood and looked at her with those eyes that were, she had come to understand, the truest indicator of his interior state. "You heard," he said. "I heard," she said. "I have to go back to Silver City. I know. It will take perhaps 2 weeks, perhaps more." She met his gaze and said what she thought. "Then go and tell them everything and come back." Something in him eased at the simplicity of that. "Clara." "Yes. When I come back," he said carefully, "I would like to speak to your father about something." She understood exactly what he meant, and a warmth moved through her that began in her chest and reached her fingertips. "He will be available," she said. "He left on Saturday morning, and the 2 weeks stretched themselves out into something considerably longer." She received one letter from Silver City at the end of the first week, written in his careful, slightly formal hand, telling her that the testimony had been received by the marshal's office and that there were additional matters requiring his presence that he had not anticipated. He did not elaborate. He said he was well. He said he thought of the Whitmore ranch in the evenings with considerable frequency. She read that last part twice and then put the letter in the Tennyson he had given her, between 2 particular pages, and did not think too carefully about which pages they were. 3 weeks became 4 and then 5. December ended and January began with a cold snap that froze the water troughs and kept Clara close to the house and the fire. She wrote to him twice, to the care of the marshal's office in Silver City, and waited. Her father watched her with a quiet attention during this period. He was not a man who pried, but he was perceptive, and one evening he sat beside her at the fire and said, without preamble, "He will come back." "You cannot know that," she said, not bitterly, just honestly. "I know men," Elias said, "and I know what I saw in his face when he looked at you." She did not argue further. She let the warmth of that observation sit with her. The letter that arrived in mid-January was longer than the first, and its contents explained the delay. The trial proceedings against Elroy Hatch were moving forward, but Rafe's testimony had opened threads that the new marshal had pursued with considerable energy, and those threads had led to Colton Vance, the previous deputy marshal who had suppressed Rafe's original report. Vance was now also facing charges, and Rafe had been required to remain available for additional questioning. He wrote that it was grinding and slow, the machinery of territorial justice, but that it appeared to be actually functioning, which he had not been entirely confident it could do. He wrote also, toward the end of the letter, "I think of our last conversation in front of the corral gate frequently. I think of many things with a frequency that a man of my usual composure should perhaps find alarming, but which I find instead something closer to consoling. I am not a man practiced in the language of sentiment, so I will say only this plainly. I intend to return to Dustfield as soon as I am permitted, and when I do, I have questions to ask and things to say that I have been rehearsing in my head by lamplight, which is perhaps undignified but is nonetheless the truth." She read that paragraph to her father because she wanted to read it to someone, and Elias listened with his eyes on the fire, and when she finished he said, "Good man," again, and picked up his almanac, and Clara folded the letter away and felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for 5 weeks. He came back on a Thursday in the third week of January, riding into the ranch yard at midday on the bay horse with his saddlebags packed, and his hat pulled low against a wind that was blowing out of the northwest with serious intentions. Clara was at the well when she heard the hoofbeats and turned, and when she saw who it was, she set down her bucket with a deliberateness that was intended to prevent her from doing something undignified like running. She walked to meet him as he dismounted. He looked tired, travel-worn in the specific way that many cold miles on horseback produce, but his eyes were clear, and that interior weight she had learned to read in him seemed different. Not gone exactly, but shifted, as though something had been put down that he had been carrying for a very long time. "Mr. Calloway," she said. "Miss Whitmore," he said. A beat of silence, and then they both smiled, and it was one of those smiles that carries everything underneath it. "Hatch?" she asked. "Trial is set for March," he said. "The marshal is confident. The evidence is substantial. Vance has provided additional testimony in exchange for a reduced charge. The whole thing is considerably more resolved than it was." He paused. "They cleared my name in writing. The marshal gave me a document." She felt a fierce, private gladness at that. "Good," she said. "That is good." "Clara," he said, and there was that particular quality in his voice that she had come to understand was him moving toward something important. "Yes," she said. "I told you I had things to say when I came back." "You did." He looked at her steadily. The wind moved around them. His hat brim cast a shadow across part of his face, and she could still see everything she needed to see. "I would like to say them," he said. "Then say them." He was quiet for a moment, the way he always was before he spoke something he meant deeply. "I am not an easy man," he said. "I have made considerable errors in my life. I have ridden away from things I should have stayed for, and I have stayed for things I should have ridden away from, and my capacity to distinguish between the two is imperfect at best. I carry things that take up space. I am not—" He stopped, and something passed across his expression that was rare in him, something vulnerable in the most honest sense of the word. "I am not a man who would blame you for wanting something less complicated." She looked at him. The wind had picked up and the cold was sharp, and she could see her breath and his breath making small clouds in the air between them. "Rafe," she said. "I know what I am," he continued, as though he needed to finish what he had started. "I know what I have done and what I have left undone, and what came before, and I know that a woman like you deserves someone who comes to her without all of that." He held her gaze with a directness that was almost painful in its honesty. "I am telling you plainly that I am not that man. I am not worthy of what I want to ask you, and I know it." He said it without drama or performance. He said it as a man states a fact he has thought about carefully and has concluded is true. And because Clara Whitmore was a woman who thought clearly and said what she thought, and because she had spent 2 months watching this man with close attention and had arrived at conclusions of her own, she looked him directly in the eye and said, without hesitation, "I disagree completely." He blinked. It was the first time she had seen him caught genuinely off guard, and she would remember it for the rest of her life. "Clara," he began. "I disagree," she said again, steady and certain. "You are describing yourself as though you are a ledger of deficits, and you are not. You are a man who held to his principles at significant personal cost. You are a man who has carried guilt for someone else's crime because you are the kind of person who takes responsibility seriously. You are a man who brought me a book of poetry and washed dishes without being asked and listens when people speak and treats my father like a person worth knowing." She took a step toward him. "You have decided what you are worth, and I am telling you that your accounting is wrong." He stared at her. The wind was the only sound for a moment. "That is not a small thing to say," he said finally. "No," she agreed. "It is not. I say it because I mean it." He was looking at her with an expression that was entirely open, all the containment temporarily set aside, and she could see something moving behind his eyes that was working to take in what she had said and decide whether to trust it. She understood this. She waited. "I was going to ask your father for permission to court you formally," he said, "when I came back. But I told myself on the road home that I had to tell you first what I told you just now, because it would not be fair to you to proceed without knowing. That was the right instinct," she said, "and now you know my answer to it. So ask my father." Something happened in his face then. The thing that had been working to believe what she said found its footing, and she watched the shift happen, watched him stand a little differently, as though a weight had adjusted itself into something more manageable. "You are," he began. "Astute," she supplied. "You said so yourself months ago." A laugh came out of him, genuine and unguarded, the kind of laugh she had heard from him only twice before and had decided was one of her favorite sounds. He stepped forward and took her hand in both of his very carefully, as though she were something worth handling with care. "Clara Whitmore," he said. "Rafe Calloway," she said. "I am going to ask your father if I may formally court you. And I am going to go make coffee," she said, "because you look like you have been riding for 3 days and you need it." He laughed again, and she went inside, and a few minutes later she could hear the low rumble of his voice on the porch as he spoke to her father, and she stood at the stove with the coffee pot and listened to the cadence of it without trying to hear the words. And the kitchen was warm, and the coffee smelled right, and outside the wind was rattling the window glass, and she thought that this was one of the better moments of her 22 years. The formal courtship lasted through the rest of January and into February, which in practice meant that Rafe came to supper 3 times a week and took Clara for rides on Sunday afternoons when the weather permitted, and they talked about everything. Books and land and faith and politics, and the right way to raise cattle and the wrong way to handle a difficult horse, and the question of whether the territorial government would ever function properly, and what a person owed to the community they lived in versus what they owed to their own conscience. These conversations had the quality of 2 people discovering that their minds were genuinely companionable, which is different from and more durable than the discovery that 2 people are attracted to each other, though both were operating simultaneously. Clara found that she could say things to him that she had not said to anyone, ideas half-formed and uncertain, opinions she was not fully sure of yet, and he would take them seriously and engage with them honestly rather than either dismissing them or agreeing with everything she said, and both of those wrong responses would have told her something important about his character. She was also, she acknowledged privately, simply deeply drawn to him in the most straightforward physical sense, to the particular quality of his hands and the way he sat a horse, and the sound of his voice in the evenings when they would sit on the porch with their coffee after supper, and the cold pressed in around them, and the stars did their extraordinary thing overhead. She was not a woman who confused this with the other thing, the deeper knowing, but she was also not a woman who pretended it was irrelevant, because it was not. In early February he asked her, on a Sunday afternoon ride out to the mesa east of the ranch, with the winter light turning everything golden and the air tasting of frost and sage, if she would marry him. He said it plainly and directly, the way he said everything, looking at her from horseback with the mesa behind him and his hat in his hand because he had taken it off, which she understood was a gesture of genuine sincerity rather than ceremony. He said that he loved her, which he said with the careful deliberateness of a man who had been carrying the words for a while and had decided they were ready to be spoken, and that he wanted to build something with her, a life in this specific landscape that had become, in the months since his arrival in Dustfield, the closest thing to home he had known in many years. She did not make him wait for the answer. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." They were married in March, in the white church in Dustfield, on a day when the sky was the specific impossible blue that only happens in the high desert in early spring. Mrs. Prout decorated the church with dried wildflowers and whatever greenery could be sourced in March, and Me Holt baked a cake that was more ambitious than the available ingredients strictly supported, but was nonetheless wonderful. Elias Whitmore walked his daughter down the aisle with a steadiness that cost him something. Clara knew, because she could see the moisture in his eyes that he was too dignified to let fall, and she squeezed his arm, and he covered her hand with his for a moment before releasing her. Rafe stood at the front of the church in a dark coat that he had purchased for the occasion and a shirt that was actually pressed, and when he saw her coming toward him, he looked at her with an expression that she was certain she would be able to recall precisely for the rest of her life, because it was the expression of a man who cannot quite believe his own good fortune and is too honest to pretend he is not moved by it. The minister, Reverend Dalton, a small man with a large voice, performed the ceremony with a brevity and sincerity that suited both of them. When Rafe took her hands in his and said the words, he said them to her and not to the room, which was exactly right. And when the ceremony was concluded and the Reverend told him he could kiss his bride, he cupped her face gently in his hands and kissed her with the same gentleness that had characterized the first time, which was not diminishment but was instead a continuity, the same man, unchanged, consistent. The room cheered. Her father clapped with his eyes still bright. Me Holt wept with the generous abandon of a woman who has reached the age at which other people's happiness is unambiguously a gift. They spent their wedding night at the boarding house, in the room that had been Me Holt's best kept clean and decorated with a small vase of paper flowers, and outside the desert was dark and enormous and full of its own quiet business, and inside the lamplight was warm and they were, for the first time, entirely alone together without a social context pressing its expectations into the space. They talked for a long time before they slept, which was not what either of them had perhaps expected but which was entirely natural given who they were, and they discovered in the talking that they were both mildly nervous in a way that was touching rather than unfortunate, and the acknowledgement of that mutual nervousness did what nervousness acknowledged usually does, which is to dissolve it considerably. By morning, they were married in every sense of the word, and Clara lay awake in the gray pre-dawn watching the window lighten and listening to him breathe beside her, and thought that she had been right about his worth. And she thought this not as vindication, but as simple satisfaction, the satisfaction of a person who assessed something carefully and found that the thing bore out under closer examination. They moved into the Whitmore ranch together, which was large enough for 3 adults to live in without excessive friction, and Rafe settled into the work of the ranch with the ease of a man who has found a place that fits. He and Elias developed a working partnership that was efficient and comfortable, each man understanding what the other was good at and organizing their days accordingly. Rafe was particularly skilled with horses, which Elias was not, and Elias had a talent for the agricultural side of the operation, the garden and the grain stores, that Rafe respected and deferred to. The spring of 1879 brought with it, along with the warming air and the first wildflowers in the arroyos, news from Silver City that the trial of Elroy Hatch had concluded with a conviction on multiple counts of corruption and extortion. He was sentenced to 7 years in the territorial prison. Colton Vance received 2 years for suppression of evidence. The document the new marshal had given Rafe, clearing his name, was now part of the official record. Rafe received this news by letter on a Tuesday morning and read it at the kitchen table while Clara refilled his coffee, and when he was done reading he set the letter down and was quiet for a moment. "Good," he said finally. "Yes," she agreed. "It does not undo what happened," he said. "No," she said, "but it matters anyway." He looked up at her. "Yes, it does." He stood from the table and folded the letter carefully and put it in the pocket of his shirt, over his chest, and went outside to start the day's work. And Clara watched him go and thought about the way justice, even when delayed and imperfect, can shift the angle of the light on something. That summer, Clara's pregnancy became apparent, and the news was received throughout Dustfield with the general delight that small communities reserve for evidence that their members are building future generations. Elias, upon being told, sat very still for a full minute, which was his version of celebration, And then he stood and shook his son-in-law's hand with both of his own. And then he kissed his daughter on the forehead and went outside to walk the perimeter of the property for an hour, which Clara understood was how he processed large feelings. Rafe was not a man who demonstrated emotion extravagantly, but during the months of her pregnancy, he attended to her with a constancy and a quiet care that said everything his understated language could not. He took over the heavier physical tasks without being asked and without drawing attention to it. He checked in on her throughout the day with the casualness of someone who is genuinely interested in the answer to how are you feeling rather than performing the question. He was present in the way that matters, which is the unglamorous, continuous, daily way. In the evenings, he would sometimes put his hand against her growing middle with a careful reverence that undid her in the best possible sense, and she would watch his face in those moments and see the thing she had first glimpsed on the sidewalk boards in October of the year before, that quality of genuine openness that he usually kept behind his containment. And she thought that she had been given something remarkable in this man, this complicated, principled, self-doubting, deeply good man. "You are going to be a wonderful father," she told him one October evening, exactly a year after his arrival in Dustfield, sitting together on the porch in the autumn air that smelled the same as it had that first time, that particular desert copper and sage smell. He was quiet for a moment. "I hope that is true," he said. "I know it is." "You have a great deal of confidence in things you cannot be fully certain of," he said. "I disagree," she said. "I am very certain about the things I am certain about. And the things I am not certain about, I say so." He looked at her with that particular expression she had catalogued and saved, the one that combined affection and something very close to awe, which she found both moving and faintly funny because she did not think she was extraordinary. She thought she was simply honest, and she remained puzzled that this should be rare enough to inspire awe. "I love you," he said. "I know," she said. "I love you as well." He reached across and took her hand, and they sat in the evening air as the stars came out one by one, and the coyotes began their distant dialogue, and the desert prepared itself for another night. Their son was born in November, 2 days after the anniversary of Rafe's arrival in Dustfield, delivered by the excellent hands of Dr. Aldrich, who had, Clara noted with private amusement, been present at the very beginning of the whole business. The baby was healthy and loud about it, and had, within the first hour of his life, already demonstrated a decided opinion about being cold, which he expressed with eloquence. Rafe held his son in the small hours after the birth, while Clara slept in the exhaustion of the accomplished, and he stood at the window with the baby in the crook of his arm and looked out at the desert night. And me Holt, who had come to help, and was sitting in the corner knitting with a discretion that allowed her to observe without intruding, said afterwards that she had never seen a man's face look quite like that. Like a man who has understood something about the world that he had thought he understood before, but had been mistaken. They named him Elias James Calloway, the first name for the grandfather who received the news of it with exactly the same still, quiet manner he received all important things, and the second for Rafe's father, who had been a good man in his way, Rafe said, and whose name deserved carrying forward. Young Elias, called Eli in the daily usage, grew with the good health and loud personality that the territory somehow seemed to produce, a child who was curious about everything and afraid of very little, and who had his father's gray-blue eyes and his mother's auburn tendency in his hair, which came out a particular reddish-brown that both of them found endlessly satisfying. Life on the Whitmore ranch settled into the rhythms that are the opposite of monotony when they are chosen rhythms, the kind of daily pattern that has meaning woven through it. Rafe took on additional horses to train and sell, which became a significant part of the ranch's income, and his reputation spread through the territory as a man who had a gift with difficult animals, which was said with a particular kind of respect in a land where good horsemanship was not casually praised. Elias Sr.'s cattle herd grew steadily, and by 1881 the ranch had expanded to include additional acreage purchased from a neighbor who was returning east. Clara continued to read everything she could obtain and to loan books to anyone in town who wanted them, which led eventually to a small informal lending arrangement that operated out of the ranch on Saturdays when people came by for it. Mrs. Prout, the school teacher, called it the finest thing to happen to Dustfield's intellectual life, which was perhaps generous, but Clara did not argue with her. In the spring of 1882, Rafe's sister Beulah made the journey from Abilene to visit, which required considerable logistical planning, and which Clara anticipated with some nervousness that she declined to share with her husband. Beulah arrived on the weekly stage in a cloud of good-natured efficiency, a woman of 31 with Rafe's same gray-blue eyes and none of his reserve, who greeted Clara within 10 minutes of arrival with the frank affection of someone who had decided in advance to approve and found the reality confirming the decision. "He wrote about you," Beulah said to Clara, in the kitchen the first evening while Rafe and Beulah's husband Thomas, a quiet Abilene banker who had survived the journey without complaint, sat on the porch with Elias and the whiskey. "Did he?" Clara said. "More than you might think," Beulah said, "for a man who does not say much in letters." "He said you disagreed with him about something important." Clara looked up from the pot she was stirring. "He wrote about that. He said it was the most important thing anyone had said to him in a very long time," Beulah said. She was looking at Clara with a directness that was very familiar. "He has always been hard on himself, harder than is fair. Whatever you said to him about it, it mattered." "He earned it," Clara said simply. "I just said what was accurate." Beulah smiled with the specific satisfaction of a sister who has watched her brother be difficult to love for many years and is pleased that someone has managed it. "Yes," she said. "But the saying of it at the right moment is its own kind of thing." Beulah and Thomas stayed for 2 weeks, and the house was full in a way it had not been before, full in the good sense, the sense of noise and laughter, and the particular chaos of Eli at nearly 3 years old performing for an appreciative new audience. Rafe was different with his sister present, or rather he was the same, but an additional layer of him was visible, the layer of the boy from the Texas Hill Country who had grown up with this particular person and shared references and memories that Clara could not access but was glad existed. She watched him one evening at the table, laughing at something Beulah said, a full laugh with his head back and his eyes creased, and she thought, as she had thought many times by now and did not tire of thinking, about that first moment on the sidewalk boards in October of 1878, a man bleeding from a wound and tipping his hat to her as though the world still deserved courtesy, and she thought about all the small and large steps between that moment and this one. And the dinner table with its lamp and its noise and her son asleep in the next room, and her father telling Thomas about his cattle, with the proud specificity of a man who has built something real. After Beulah and Thomas departed, the ranch settled back into its usual rhythms, and the summer of 1882 unfolded in the good way that summers do when the water situation is manageable, and the cattle are healthy, and the garden is producing, and the family within the house is genuinely glad of one another. It was in August of that summer that the situation arose with the Briggs family, which was the closest thing to community trouble that Dustfield experienced that year, and which said something about the kind of place Dustfield was trying to become. Old Joseph Briggs, who had run the general store since the town's early days, died of a heart episode in August, and his store and its inventory were claimed by a cousin from back east who had no interest in running a store in the territory and wanted to liquidate the assets and return to Ohio. The problem was that a significant number of families in and around Dustfield had accounts at Briggs that had been informally extended, the kind of credit that a man like Joseph Briggs maintained on good faith and a handshake, and the cousin from Ohio had no record of these arrangements because Briggs had kept them in his head as much as on paper. This created genuine hardship for several families, and the cousin was within his legal rights, though not his moral ones, to demand immediate settlement or claim the goods already extended. Rafe brought this situation home one evening and discussed it with Clara and her father with the seriousness it deserved. "There are families who cannot pay what he is asking," Rafe said, "and he will take them to the county court if they cannot produce the documentation." "Joseph was not a man for paperwork," Elias said. "No," Rafe agreed. "He was a man for people." Clara thought about it. "Who holds the mortgages on the properties of the families most at risk?" This led to 2 days of conversation with the affected parties, which led to a meeting at the church where the community discussed the problem collectively, which led to a solution that was not elegant but was practical. A collection, pooled from those who had the means to contribute, that settled the most pressing of the disputed accounts, combined with a negotiated arrangement with the cousin that allowed the store to continue operating under new local management until a proper buyer could be found. Rafe organized much of this without seeking credit for it, which was characteristically him, and several people in town commented to Clara that her husband was the kind of man a community was fortunate to have in it, and she agreed with them wholeheartedly and did not bother to add that she had known this for some time. The man who eventually purchased Briggs' store was a fellow named Samuel Ockafer, who had been working in Albuquerque and was looking to establish his own enterprise. He was a capable businessman and a decent man, and his arrival in Dustfield was, like most arrivals in the territory, attended by various attitudes from the existing residents. Rafe was among the first to welcome him properly, which Clara noted with the quiet satisfaction she always felt when evidence confirmed what she already believed. He helped Samuel unload his wagon, introduced him to the other merchants, and treated him with the straightforward respect he gave to anyone who worked honestly and harmed no one. Clara brought a meal to Samuel's establishment on his first day of operation, and when a few of the town's more intractable characters made their views known about the new ownership in language that was ugly, Rafe and Elias and 2 other ranchers were the first to make their continued patronage of the store explicit and public, which was the kind of social lever that small economies understood. There were injustices built into the territory, into the land itself, and the way it had been taken and distributed, that could not be undone by the gestures of good-hearted individuals, and Clara understood this. But she also understood that how you treated the person in front of you was not nothing, and that building one small community toward decency was not a substitute for larger justice, but was not without its own value. By the autumn of 1882, Dustfield had settled into a relative prosperity and peace that felt earned rather than accidental. The new marshal's reforms had reached even into the smaller towns of the territory, and the era of the most brazen kind of corruption and violence was giving way to something slower and more procedural that was not perfect, but was progress of a kind. Clara's second pregnancy announced itself in October, with the particular certainty that her body communicated such things, and she told Rafe on a Tuesday evening when Eli was already asleep and her father had retired early and they were alone at the kitchen table with their tea. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he reached across the table and covered her hand with his. He did not say anything immediately, which was his way, and she waited, and then he said quietly, "Thank you." She laughed, soft and genuine. "I believe the credit for this is distributed equally." "I know," he said. "I mean for this life, for all of it." She turned her hand under his so their fingers were woven together. "We built it together," she said. "You convinced me it was possible," he said. She understood what he meant. She understood that he was talking about a particular moment on a January day in front of a corral gate, and about everything that moment had opened up. "You just needed an accurate assessment," she said. The second pregnancy was easier than the first in some ways and harder in others, the winter being colder than the previous year, and the territory not being any more forgiving of its harshness, just because a woman was expecting. But Rafe managed the physical load with the same quiet competence, and Elia's was if anything more attentive than before, having established during Eli's birth that grandfatherhood was a condition he found deeply agreeable. Their daughter arrived in June of 1883, delivered again by Dr. Aldridge, who had taken to calling himself the Calloway family physician with a dry humor that Clara appreciated. She was born on a hot morning with a perfect blue sky outside the window, loud and pink and furious about the indignity of the whole procedure. And Clara, exhausted and triumphant, looked at her daughter and felt the kind of love that arrives already enormous, with no warm-up period required. Rafe sat beside the bed with the baby in his arms and looked from the baby to his wife and back, and Clara could see on his face exactly what she had seen when Eli was born, that particular understanding that had no words adequate to it. They named her Rose Adelaide Calloway, the first name because it suited her and the second for Clara's mother, whose memory deserved to be carried forward into this generation that was growing up in the light of the desert rather than the green of Missouri, but who would know her name. Eli, who was 3.5 and had been extensively prepared for the arrival of a sibling, studied his sister with grave seriousness for several minutes when he was brought in to meet her, and then pronounced her acceptable and went to find his grandfather to report on the proceedings, which he did with considerable authority. The years moved in the way good years do, not quickly, because good years deserve their full weight, but with a momentum that feels, in retrospect, both inevitable and miraculous. Eli grew into a boy who was curious and stubborn, and had his mother's directness and his father's contained intensity, and who was absolutely devoted to horses in a way that delighted his father and occasionally alarmed his mother. Rose was quieter than her brother, more interior, with a gift for observation that Clara recognized, and a patience that she suspected came from some part of the Calloway inheritance. Rafe's reputation as a horseman continued to grow throughout the territory, and by 1885 he was receiving letters from as far as Colorado requesting his services in training specific animals, which led to a modest but genuine expansion of that side of the operation. He never became a wealthy man and had no particular ambition in that direction, but the ranch was comfortable and the debts were manageable, and the life was full in the ways that mattered. Clara's lending library, which had grown from the informal Saturday arrangement into something considerably more organized and comprehensive, housed over 200 volumes by 1885, contributed to by donations from throughout the territory, and was used by children and adults alike. Mrs. Prout, who had retired from the schoolhouse to a well-earned old age, declared it Clara's greatest public contribution, and Clara said she thought raising 2 decent children was probably the greater one, and Mrs. Prout said there was no reason it could not be both. On an October evening in 1885, exactly 7 years after a man on a bay horse had come in from the south with a wound in his side, and had tipped his hat to a woman he had never met, Clara and Rafe sat together on the porch of the ranch house after the children were in bed and Elias had retired, and they sat in the same quality of autumn air that had been the backdrop to the very beginning of the thing, that copper and sage smell. That temperature that was too cool for comfort without a coat, but bearable if you sat close. Rafe's arm was around her shoulders, and she was leaning against him with the comfort of 7 years of the particular knowledge of another person's body, and the stars overhead were doing what they had always done out here, which was to perform an extravagance that still, after all this time, stopped her thoughts for a moment each time she looked up. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, the way he sometimes asked when the silence between them had taken on a particular quality. "October," she said. "The first one when you rode in." She felt him nod, the slight movement of his chin against the top of her head. "I thought about leaving before I came inside," he said. She looked up at him. "Leaving Dustfield?" "Yes. When I heard the doctor say the wound was not serious, I thought about riding out that same night. She had not known this. Why didn't you? He was quiet for a moment in the way she had spent 7 years learning to read. I saw you, he said, coming through the crowd before you saw me. I watched you move people aside to get to where you needed to be, and I thought that is a person of considerable purpose. She laughed softly. That is not a romantic thing. No, he agreed. But it was the true thing. And then you knelt down and looked at the wound with exactly the same directness you look at everything, and I thought that I would like to be looked at like that, to be seen that clearly. Clara was quiet for a moment, feeling the weight of that, the way it landed in her chest. You were, she said. You are. Whatever else has been imperfect in any of this, that part has always been exactly so. He pressed his lips to her hair. I know, he said. I know that now. The horses were quiet in the corral. Somewhere across the dark land, a coyote said something brief and then was silent. The lamp in the kitchen window was still lit, casting a rectangle of warmth onto the yard, and the night around it was the deep, enormous dark of the territory, full of its own old life. That day by the corral gate, she said, when I told you I disagreed with your assessment of yourself. I think about that regularly, he said. What do you think about it? He considered. That it was the most useful thing anyone has ever said to me. Not because it absolved me of anything, but because it made the things I carried feel like they had the right proportion, like I had been carrying them in a way that made them larger than they were. You had, she said, not because you were weak. Because you are precise about responsibility, but precision about responsibility can shade into something that is not quite accurate if you apply it only in one direction. He made a sound that was half laugh and half something more serious. You have thought about this. I have thought about you, she said, which amounts to the same thing. He turned his head, and she turned hers, and they looked at each other in the lamplight and the starlight, at the faces they knew completely and which still, after all this time, held things that surprised and interested and moved them. Because that is what it is to love someone who is genuinely themselves, rather than a simplified version of themselves. I love you, he said, which he said with the same careful weight he had used the first time, because it had never become casual, not in 7 years, because he understood that casualness was not the same as comfort, and they had comfort in abundance without needing to sacrifice the weight. I love you, she said. The same words, and they carried the same weight, and all of the 7 years were inside them. They sat until the chill made it impractical to remain, and then they went inside and banked the fire, and moved through the quiet house together and checked on the children, as they did every night. Eli sleeping with his habitual sprawl that required the full width of the bed, and Rose curled on her side with her small face entirely at peace. And they stood in the doorways of each room for a moment with the particular feeling that parents know, which is composed equally of love and fear and gratitude, and a kind of almost painful tenderness. Then they went to their own room, and the lamp was extinguished, and the desert night was present at the window with its stars and its cold and its immensity. And inside the room was warm, and they were together, and this was the life they had made, deliberately and carefully, and against the odds of distance and doubt and a man's honest and incorrect belief in his own unworthiness. He had called himself unworthy of her, and she had looked him in the eye and told him he was wrong. And she had spent 7 years proving it, not because she felt the need to prove anything, but because the proof was simply the ordinary accumulation of the life they lived together, every day. The work and the children and the conversations and the silence and the hands reaching toward each other across tables, and the years moving through them like weather, changing the landscape but not the essential geography. In the spring of 1886, Beulah wrote to say that she and Thomas were expecting their first child, and the letter that Rafe wrote back to his sister was, by his own account, the longest letter he had written to anyone in his life. Clara read it before he sent it, and found in it a tenderness and a specific joy that made her set it down for a moment, and simply feel the fullness of the life she was living. Eli, at 6 years old, was already helping in the corral, which Rafe permitted with the careful supervision of a man who took seriously both a child's need to learn and a child's need to be safe. Eli had his father's instinct with horses, which was the observation that produced the most visible pleasure in Rafe, the quieter private kind that he expressed with a look rather than a speech, a look that Clara caught every time. Rose at 3 was already the family's most attentive observer, the child who sat at the kitchen table when people were talking and listened without appearing to listen, and who could, when required, reproduce the substance of conversation she had supposedly been paying no attention to. Clara recognized in this something of her own younger self, and she fostered it with the deliberate intention of a woman who understands the value of being listened to and the power of listening well. The ranch had grown in its modest way into a property that reflected the effort of the people on it. The fences held, the horses were well. The garden, which Clara tended with a stubbornness that even the territory's difficult soil eventually had to respect, produced abundantly in summer. The house had been expanded twice, once to add a proper bedroom for Eli and once to add a workroom for Clara's books, which had become numerous enough to require their own space. Elias Whitmore, who had aged in the way of men who have worked well and lived honestly, was slower now in his movements but undiminished in his mind, and he had found in his son-in-law a kind of friendship that supplemented the filial relationship with something that stood on its own. They were men who understood each other's calibrations, who knew what they were looking at when they looked at the land and at each other, and they had the comfortable wordlessness of people who do not need to speak to be in company. One evening in the summer of 1886, Elias sat on the porch in the last light and called Clara out to sit with him, just the two of them, which was not unusual but had a particular quality that evening she could not name until he said what he said. "Your mother would have loved this," he said. He was looking out at the land, the dry summer grass and the distant mountains. "Yes," Clara said, "she would have. She would have loved him," he said. She had a gift for seeing people accurately. Clara looked at her father's profile, the older version of the face she had known all her life, weathered and still, and she felt the grief for her mother that had never fully departed but had changed its shape over the years into something she could hold alongside everything else. "I got that from her," Clara said. "You did," her father said. "It is her best gift and you have used it well." They sat together in the last of the light and watched the shadows come down off the mountains across the dry golden land, and it was one of those moments that does not announce itself as significant but deposits itself permanently in memory anyway. Rafe found them there when he came up from the barn, and he joined them without ceremony, sitting on the step below Clara's chair and leaning back against her knees with the ease of a man entirely at home in his own life. And Elias said something about the horses and Rafe responded, and the evening turned slowly into night, and the stars came out, and the lamp was not yet lit, and there was no need to speak very much. And all of the things that had been difficult, and were now resolved, resided peacefully inside the ordinary beauty of the evening. Later, when the children were in bed and Elias had retired, and the lamp was lit in the kitchen and Rafe was sitting at the table with the accounts he kept for the horse operation, Clara stood in the doorway and looked at him and thought about that October morning 7 years ago in a very different way than she usually did. She usually remembered it as a beginning, which it was. But she saw now that it was also a kind of rescue, of the mutual and unannounced kind. He had ridden into a town and nearly bled on its sidewalk, and she had kept pressure on the wound and sent for the doctor. And somewhere in that plain exchange of need and help, something had begun that had rescued each of them from the particular solitude they had been carrying, his of guilt and wandering and hers of grief, and the particular ache of a very active mind without enough to press against. "Come to bed," she said. He looked up from the accounts and at her, and smiled, which was, even after all this time, a thing of considerable power, the full smile that he had always been sparing with and which she had therefore never been able to take for granted. "In a moment," he said. She went and stood behind him and put her hands on his shoulders, and he covered one of her hands with his and held it, still looking at the accounts, and she looked over his shoulder at the numbers he was entering in his careful hand. And the lamp was warm and the house was quiet, and outside the territory was doing its enormous, indifferent, beautiful thing. And this was enough, and more than enough. And it was the life they had built from a handkerchief pressed against a wound, and a book of poetry, and a woman who disagreed completely with a man's wrong opinion of himself. It was the life they would keep building, in all its ordinary and extraordinary parts, for as long as they were given to build it, which was what a life was for when you were lucky enough to be spending it with the right person. The stars outside the window of the kitchen did not care about any of this, being stars. But they burned with their ancient and indifferent light across the roof of the house and the barn and the corral and the garden and the graves of the cattle that did not survive every winter. And they illuminated the road into Dustfield, and the church where they had married and the store where a book of Tennyson had been purchased, as though it were the most natural thing in the world, which it had turned out to be. Inside the house, the lamp burned with its smaller, warmer, entirely partial light, and the man at the table and the woman behind him were held within it, two people who had found each other by the specific accident of a bullet graze, and a woman who kept her handkerchief clean, and a man who tipped his hat from the boards of a sidewalk when everything else was against him. And outside the territory breathed its old, dry breath, and the night was full of sound if you knew how to listen, and the morning would come with its blue sky and its cold and its considerable demands, and they would meet it together, which was the only way worth meeting it. Young Eli turned over in his sleep and flung his arm across his pillow with the abandon of a boy who has no weight to carry yet, whose father has worked hard to ensure that. Rose breathed quietly in her small bed, already composing her observations. Elias Whitmore lay in his room listening to the house breathe and felt, in the quiet of his old age, the thing that is peace. And Rafe Calloway closed his accounts book and put down his pen, and turned in his chair to look at his wife, and Clara Whitmore Calloway looked back at him, and between them was everything that 7 years of honest choosing had built, every meal and every conversation and every cold morning and every warm evening and every child and every grief and every joy and every moment in which one of them had reached toward the other and the other had been there. "I am glad I stayed," he said. "I know," she said, "so am I." She took his hand and they walked together through the quiet house, past the children sleeping, past the father at rest, through the life they had made from nothing more and nothing less than the willingness to look at each other clearly and decide that what they saw was worth everything it would cost. It had cost, and it had been worth it. And in the desert of the New Mexico territory, in the last years of that wild and difficult and astonishing century, that was enough. That was, in the full accounting, everything.